Hello and welcome to this Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office Lunch and Learn presentation. Uh, I'm Christina Wyckoff, the historical archaeologist with the Oklahoma SHPO, and today it's my pleasure to introduce Catherine Lavoie, Chief of the Historic American Buildings Survey of the National Park Service. Catherine has a master's degree in American Studies from the University of Maryland with an emphasis in historic preservation and material culture. She worked in state and local preservation before coming to HABS. Recently, she co-authored Buildings of Maryland, the latest in the Society of Architectural Historians Buildings of the United States series. Thank you so much for joining us, Catherine.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I guess I'll just jump right in. For 90 years now, the Historic American Buildings Survey, or HABS as we're more commonly referred to, has been at the forefront of recording America's architectural legacy, embracing buildings and sites ranging from the architect design and the monumental to the humble vernacular and utilitarian. We have over 45,000 buildings and sites represented in the archive of measured drawings, photographs, and historical reports kept at the Library of Congress. There is, in fact, no other archive that matches it in scope, quality, and uniformity. Established as a New Deal Make Work program, HABS was, in fact, a call to action, spurred by the perceived loss of America's early architecture to create a record for future generations. It's a concept that remains just as relevant today as important historic buildings continue to be lost. But it was the first time that the federal government took action to recognize and protect our nation's architectural legacy, and thus HABS laid the groundwork for many of the preservation programs and initiatives to come. It established concepts such as conducting field survey to identify significant and representative building forms, developing its listing as commonly used by the National Register in the form of these index cards. So cards were created for every building of interest. And then documentation was created of those buildings for the public benefit. HABS is really unique in that it was established through a public-private partnership that spans two branches of government to include the National Park Service, the Library of Congress, and the American Institute of Architects. The National Park Service operates the program, producing documentation while field testing new technologies for application within the context of the Secretary of the Interior standards. The AIA provides advice and advocacy through the lens of private sector practice and underpins certain HABS activities. The Library of Congress, of course, maintains the collection and makes it available through its website, which receives about 1 million visitors per year from all over the country and around the globe. It's really hard to imagine that in the current political and economic climate, an archive so conceived could be created today. So we are very grateful to the visionaries of the 1930s. So I'm going to talk about our mission and goals at HABS, and then about how and why HABS was created in the 1930s, and finally talk specifically about HABS documentation in Oklahoma. So our mission is really fourfold, as you can see here. So diving in a bit, as I mentioned, we create documentation, but we are also the clearinghouse for all the documentation produced, whether it be through mitigation, student competitions, or donations. So the records are stored and made available online and copyright free, which is really amazing. And I think that's one of the reasons the collection is used so frequently. You have high quality images and anyone can use them. You can query the collection for any number of building types and styles, regional areas, or social and cultural movements. So hopefully some of you are familiar with our site. I have the larger opening page there at the top right, and you can see how I've typed in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and then all the individual surveys come up with a little icon. But there's also, if you look to the left, you can browse for any number. As you can see, just by looking at some of those A's, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different categories that you can query on. So we also create guidelines and standard setting documentation. So we have guidelines for each of the disciplines: history, drawings, photography. But we also create sort of prototypical documentation. And the image you see in the center of the Marmot Wasp, which is the car that won the very first Indy 500, is the perfect example of a recent area where the Historical Vehicle Association approached us with the interest of documenting cars, much in the way HARE has already been documenting maritime vessels. So we were challenged with coming up with a prototypical design and questions to ask about cars. So if you ever wondered what a car looks like in plan and elevation, well, there you go. I also wanted to call out the HABS guide to field documentation. So we created this guideline specifically for non-professionals. We came to recognize that preservation students are as likely these days to create documentation for the collection as architecture students with some architectural background. So we created this basic how-to, which also talks about field observations to get the student to engage with the building. So it talks about how to read a building. As I often like to tell students, you don't have to be an architectural historian to add to our understanding of the building. Just by describing what you see, you sort of create a baseline and paint a picture for future researchers. Field testing new recording methods and technologies. Boy, this is a constantly moving target that we try to keep on top of so that we can inform the public about best practices. But this is an example. This is the amphitheater at Arlington National Cemetery. It's a very large site, as you can see. So we used laser scanning, kept sending out that beam of light to capture. So you can see the screen capture at the top and an image with the Peno photo overlay. Recording architectural details, however, can be very difficult with the long-range laser scanner that we use to capture buildings. So we tend to use photogrammetry. So you can see the laser scan. It's sort of a pixelated image, and the clear view in the next on the left. So recording with photogrammetry is used, as I said, for details and also for statuary. You can see the center image with all the little blue squares. Those represent all the different camera captures that were used to they're blended together to create that image that you see on the bottom right with sort of a photo overlay. And then the architects can trace over that with a good deal of accuracy to get the drawing that you see there on the right. We also record details through hand measuring, because if you're not familiar with the laser scanner, as that beam of light goes out, there are always certain things it can't get. Can't get over the top of a cornice. If you have other buildings or vegetation blocking, there's always the need to fill in with some hand measuring. And also for recording things like molding profiles, it's really still the quickest, most effective way to do that. And we also like to engage with the building, which is particularly important when we're using student labor too. I think it's only through actually physically engaging with the building, either measuring it if you're an architect or describing it if you're a historian, that you sort of really understand the building. You notice stylistic elements and other changes over time that speak to the building's evolution. We always have the measured drawing as the final product. So for us, the laser scanned images are great information, but they're a tool towards an end. So I'm speaking about this because I know there's a lot of organizations out there doing what we refer to as scan and can. So creating laser scans for some later purpose. But we like to argue that, if you can compare here the laser scan with the measured drawings, and the detail is obviously far and above greater. Plans are not well captured. And you're not going to really give that laser scan to your contractor and hope he's going to restore your building accurately. We also do it because we need to adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards for architectural and engineering documentation. And there are 4 key points here that I've outlined. One, of course, is conveying the significance. So you want to make sure that whatever documentation you're creating, drawings, photography, history, that you're capturing those essential features and creating the context so that people can understand the structure. Uniform formats is also very important in developing an archive. So we have uniform standards for drawings, for historical reports, and for photographs. And it was actually one of the reasons why when the Library of Congress decided to start digitizing some key collections, we were among the first because of our uniform formats. Providing verifiability is also very important. So people want to be able to verify your information if they're going to build on that. HABS is an open collection, so you can always add other pieces. But that means having field records, field notes for the drawings, of course, footnotes and a bibliography for the historical report, and a negative for the photographs. And of course, long-term archival stability. And that is one of the reasons that we've been perhaps a little slow about jumping into the digital age, particularly when it comes to photography. But we are finalizing right now, working to finalize our standards for digital photography, and we will be accepting digital photographs in the near future. But, you know, again, there are challenges to quote unquote digital preservation. So for those of you old enough to know what a floppy disk is, you can sort of see how this is an ever-changing environment that we need to be mindful of too. Because, for example, the National Archives budgets 10 times the amount of money to store their digital materials as they do their paper archives. So it is something that will be a challenge in the future with how we spend our preservation dollars. Of course, I'm not advocating against digital information. In fact, our laser scanning data and other information has been really amazing in creating digital animations, virtual tours, and story maps. So this is a really sort of a fun, engaging, interpretive and educational tool. These are two examples where we documented civil rights sites in Alabama. And so we created a story map so you can sort of follow along. We've also done numerous virtual tours. This one is of Ellis Island, which has been one of our most popular ones. So we've gotten hits all over the world. You're not able to visit most of the buildings on the other side of the island, so it's very popular. And this is one of our latest, Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Again, we get a lot of parks that are either very remotely located or where accessibility to the site is an issue. And so not everyone can climb this tower. So our virtual tour is sitting in a kiosk on site so people can tour it virtually. And of course, training the next generation of preservationists is also a very important part of what we do. We've been running a student summer program for over 60 years now. And so if you query the Historic Resources Committee of the AIA, you'll probably find most people started their career as a HABS intern, which I myself did, and many of the people in our office did. So we're offering student architects and historians real world experience, paid experience. They spend 12 weeks with us in the field and in the office. And at the end, they get to present, as you can see there in the larger picture at the top, they get to present their findings at the end to staff and invited guests. So it's really fun, and it's a win-win situation all around. We also have 2 student competitions to engage the next generation. One is the Charles E. Peterson Prize for the best set of measured drawings to HABS standards. We just raised the prize money this past year, so it's now $10,000 for first place, and hopefully that'll encourage a lot of universities to take part. We also have the Holland Prize, named for the first curator of the HABS collection. It was intended to encourage architects who are doing a larger restoration project to sort of consolidate their drawing set into an individual sheet. So it's just one sheet of measured drawings, but it challenges the delineator to select only those most identifying or character defining elements, and to sort of reinvigorate the whole Beaux-Arts tradition. I thought I'd take a moment too to share some of the Peterson Prize entries from Oklahoma. We've gotten a fair amount thanks to the students at Oklahoma State University. HABS was joined in 1969 by the Historic American Engineering Record, or HARE. So HARE was put into practice with 5 engineering societies signing on as signatories in a tripartite agreement. But as you can see by looking at these examples, HARE sites are a very different beast from HABS sites. And it was actually using the laser scanner. This was what sort of motivated us to take that first leap, was trying to record things like that rocket test stand that you see on the left. We also have a very vigorous maritime program, and of course, bridges are ever popular. We did a study of covered bridges and then documented comprehensively those most represented examples of each of the various types. The thing I think is most intriguing about HARE are these process drawings. So this is Chester Power Station in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So what HARE does is they create drawings that sort of make otherwise complicated industrial processes, like generating electricity, understandable to the layperson by diagramming the process in this manner. And again, I wanted to show an example of a HARE site in Oklahoma. This Veterans Dam was actually a New Deal WPA project from the 1930s to create an emergency water source as well as a recreational outlet. The Historic American Landscape was created in 2000 with the American Society of Landscape Architects signing on to a tripartite agreement. Again, different constituency, different tool set. So you can see by these examples, landscapes are extremely large. We have at the top there, you can see ranch sites at the bottom of the Grand Canyon that we recorded. A Hawaiian heiau, a sacred site that's about the size of a football field. And then the Roosevelt Island just gives you an idea of how a section of a landscape looks very different from a building. And this was one of the more extensive projects that HALS recently undertook, and that was to document the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. So you can see how they created a large a plan and then detailed plans that include planting materials and some interpretive panels. And I wanted to call this out because it speaks to one of the primary uses these days of the documentation. So this is going to be used by the Park Service and others to restore the overly loved tidal basin, which is really in kind of sad shape right now. Again, here's some landscapes that were done, examples in Oklahoma of an estate landscape, a park, and well, 2 parks in the Tulsa Rose Garden as well, again, done by students. Okay, so how did it all begin? Well, I'd like to say that HABS was sort of created in this perfect storm of events, the beginning of fledgling preservation movements such as Colonial Williamsburg, which is pictured in that center image. But it was part of the whole colonial revival movement, creating and collecting papers and artifacts and even buildings from our colonial past. So a lot of architects at that time too were creating folio volumes like the one you see pictured on the right. So these were basically drawings, sometimes with photographs, rarely with any historical information or context. So they had use, but limited use, we'd say. So this was one of the features of HABS, that it would be comprehensive, history, drawings, photography, and that it would be done on a national scale with a national perspective. Of course, I think the most intriguing thing for those who signed on was this notion of preserving our endangered colonial heritage. And I think this image of these images of this site, it's a plantation in Louisiana, really speak to the need. Aggravated by the Depression, there were certainly many, many buildings like this that were failing, that were recorded by HABS and no longer exist, except for the HABS record. HABS was also viewed as a database for design motifs. That was one of the motivations. So those Colonial Williamsburg architects were doing exactly what HABS was doing. And we were, in fact, very much influenced by what they were doing. So they were going out in the field, creating drawings that could inform their restoration. So this was the idea among the AIA architects, that they could too turn to this database design motifs, both for restoration, but also for the design of colonial revival buildings, new buildings. What I think is really the most intriguing thing about HABS, and the reason that it has lasted so long, is this notion of creating a complete resume of the builder's art. This was actually the phrase used in the original proposal. Again, not just architect design monumental, but more common building forms, the ubiquitous log settlers cabin of a variety of which appeared in probably every state. They were also very interested in Native American and Spanish colonial architecture, which was a real eye-opener for sort of the East Coast-based architects that were behind the creation of HABS. You get a typical Cape Cod, and again, not just the plantation house, but the cabin inhabited by the enslaved. Sort of, as we say today, to tell all American stories. But in capturing those images, they also captured elements of everyday life. And I think this is one of the most exciting things too. I love going back and looking at the 30s images that include people and buildings in use. So there's some here with people and some like that old general store or the Boston restaurant with all its fun signage, I think speaks to a bygone era. So then turning to Oklahoma, I'll share with you the documentation undertaken during the 1930s and the rationale behind its selection. And then I'll discuss a surge in documentation that took place in the 1970s and then in more recent decades. So really, unfortunately, the only fieldwork and documentation completed in Ohio during that early survey period of the 1930s, and in fact, through the 1960s, was of Fort Gibson and a few other settlers' cabins in that vicinity. The reason for the limited participation in the HABS program was apparently due to a combination of the state's focus on other New Deal initiatives, such as that dam that I referred to earlier, and the late period of settlement, which limited the selection of historic buildings in the state. And I learned this through looking at the correspondence in the archive between the district officer for Oklahoma, Leon B. Center, and the HABS program managers in Washington, D.C. So among the really noteworthy aspects of the HABS program in the 1930s was that the state AIA chapters were responsible for electing their own program manager or district officer, as we refer to them. So that was the individual or individuals that conducted field survey, and they worked with a local advisory committee to identify sites for recording that they thought best represented their state's own architectural legacy. The caveat, however, was that the focus of the HABS program at that time was on colonial and early national period architecture with a cutoff date of the Civil War era. So lacking settlement from colonial times, Leon Center clearly felt limited in his selection for Oklahoma. As he pointed out, and I'll quote him, "Oklahoma is a new state, as you know, and it has been quite a tedious task to sort out the structures that are eligible for measurement. While we have no imposing structures or monuments, as can be found in the East, such structures as I have found are rugged examples of the handiwork of the earliest pioneers who came to what is now Oklahoma. For our particular district, it is unfortunate that the time limit of 1860 has not been extended about 25 years. There are structures in Oklahoma that reek with history-making events that would be interesting subjects for the survey, and in another 50 or 75 years would indeed be valuable information to have." So that is somewhat unfortunate. But first, a bit about Leon Center. He was appointed district officer at the start of the HABS program in December 1933, elected by the leadership of the AIA's Oklahoma chapter. This came perhaps in recognition of the fact that Center became Oklahoma's first registered architect in 1925. Although he received no formal education in architecture, that is, not an architectural degree, he studied architectural engineering and basic drafting and design through a correspondence school. He then apprenticed with the Kansas City firm of Smith, Ray, and Lovett, relocating to Okmulgee, Oklahoma in 1915 to open a branch office. His office was located in the Phil Tower building in Tulsa, built for oilman Wade Phillips, and Center designed the companion Philcade, pictured up there on the left, which was among his most noted works. He worked, however, in a variety of styles in addition to the Art Deco featured here, including Beaux-Arts and Modernism, as seen by the other examples that I have. During the 1930s, Center was involved in other New Deal initiatives, including promoting the federal government's renovation and modernization movement intended to lift the construction industry and create jobs while improving housing standards. So once again, Oklahoma was more focused on forward-looking aspects. Center saw great value, however, in HABS surveys in the 1930s, commenting that, quote, "The people of Oklahoma have just begun to realize that their historical landmarks are fast disappearing and that no effort has been made to save any of these structures, many of which he characterized as, quote, a shrine to the sacrifices made by those who came before us," presumably a reference to the hard life of the early pioneers. I think he was probably right on. As district officer, he was given an allotment of up to 21 draftsmen that could be employed through the Civil Works Administration in Oklahoma City, though it appears that only 6 architects were hired. And again, I did see in the correspondence him insisting that more attention be paid to this, to the HABS initiative, but he was very diligent in that. He was instructed to select a local advisory committee that would assist in the compilation of a list of buildings to be surveyed, and to act as in the general advisory capacity. So as directed, the committee consisted of 5 members, 3 architects designated by the Oklahoma chapter of the AIA, which were Leonard Bailey of Oklahoma City, Roy W. Shaw of Enid, pictured here, and Philip Wilbur, Dean of Architecture at A&M College in Stillwater. 2 non-architect members were Mr. Grant Foreman, actually an attorney by training, but later historian of Muskogee, who was actually served as the historian on the HABS projects, and James Gardner, who was an oilman from Tulsa. So both of them were recognized for their knowledge and training or their familiarity with buildings in the state. Center was to select from their list buildings which, in his opinion, should be recorded. And I've copied here the letter instructing him on how to formulate his list. So, of course, first of all, it was architectural importance. And that was meant either as a typical representative of a general class, as a unique or an exceptional example of a distinct type, or as representing some unusual or distinctive local feature of plan, design, or construction. And then, of course, historical importance, and then danger of destruction, which meant either through neglect or because of the encroachment of modern development. And then accessibility, which generally meant they were trying to cluster buildings together to ease the documentation process. So while few of these sites were recorded, Center and his committee supposedly identified 39 sites, some of which were named specifically, that should be recorded. And they used as their basis for determining that these typical themes that they thought best represented Oklahoma. And as you can see here, some of them were quote unquote Indian missions. So they were those centers of religious and educational initiatives for displaced Native Americans in an effort to convert them, I believe. So the top one is the Dwight mission that was photographed later. Also, other Native American sites, in particular, sort of the council houses and government buildings of the various tribes. They named Indian mounds, also caves that were used as early dwelling types, and then the pioneer cabin, like the example there that you see on the lower left corner. Forts built for the defense against the Indians were also on the list, with Fort Gibson, of course, being the most significant. So work began then on the documentation of Fort Gibson in 1934. According to HABS, the HABS report, Fort Gibson was, as unfortunately stated, the oldest fort in Oklahoma and one that contributed more to any other agency in civilizing the Indians. This site, as I'm sure all of you are well familiar, was later designated a National Historic Landmark for its association with the Trail of Tears and its destination point for Native American removal from the Southeast during the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. It was later reconstructed then by the WPA in 1937. I'm hoping or assuming they used the HABS drawings as a reference point. But at that time, they specifically recorded the stone buildings, including the barracks, the quartermaster's building, powerhouse, officers' quarters, and a few others. So an early fort composed of log buildings set around a parade ground and enclosed by a palisade was erected here in 1824 as the first military post in what would become Oklahoma. So one of the earliest construction projects. Again, established to sort of pacify Native Americans and enable white settlement, it was among the most important forts on the western frontier. But beginning in 1845, stone buildings replaced some of the earlier log structures. It was later abandoned and then turned over to the Cherokee Nation in 1857, but occupied by Union and Cherokee troops during the Civil War. And actually, as a note, sidebar, the Rocky Mountain Regional Office did later document those log structures that were also part of the fort. Also recorded within the general proximity of the fort was the Howard cabin, built of logs supposedly 100 years before the fort was erected, shown here on the left. Also was the cabin of Sam Houston of Texas military and political fame, who lived in Oklahoma for a period as a liaison between the government and the Cherokee Nation. Again, these cabins were important as typical representative of early Oklahoma dwelling types. But in the end of that early survey period, 60 drawing sheets were produced along with photographs and short form reports at a total cost of $2,680.88, including salaries, supplies, and travel. Sounds like a real bargain. I wish we could have that same price tag. In his final report, Center reiterated that, quote, "The historical structures of Oklahoma are fast disappearing, and probably in another 10 to 15 years, only traces will remain of these log cabins, old forts, Indian council houses, and missions that were once the cradle of our civilization," end quote. So unfortunately, it was some time before some of these additions that Center suggested were actually recorded. The HABS program was generally dormant with the onset of World War II, when all New Deal programs were shut down, and it was really it was renewed in the post-war period. So Oklahoma experienced a surge in documentation in the 1970s, thanks to the sponsorship of the Oklahoma Historical Society that funded some student field teams. In 1973, numerous buildings were recorded in Guthrie, Oklahoma, obviously significant as the territorial capital, including buildings in the commercial downtown, such as those pictured here, the Gray and Victor Brother blocks. The Victor Brother was considered among the most handsome, one of the largest of those such complexes built as a commercial venture in 1893, and the Gray Brothers built in 1890, which originally housed the Bank of the Indian Territory. Other sites that were recorded as part of that initiative was the 1903 Carnegie Library, the 1890 Trinity Church, and the 1895 P.J. Hillman House, regarded as the town's first brick building, and also noted for its design by local architect Joseph Folkart for this prominent businessman. So they were clearly looking to sort of landmarks of the community for their documentation. Then in 1975, the Oklahoma Historical Society partnered with the Cherokee National Historical Society to document a number of buildings related to Cherokee history and heritage, which I'm sure would have thrilled District Officer Center immensely, since that was among the important themes that he had early outlined. So it's nice to see it sort of come to fruition. So included then was the 1869 Cherokee National Capitol, which was built on the site of Cherokee government meetings that had occurred since their arrival in the Indian Territory in 1839. The 1844 Cherokee Supreme Court building, the first permanent structure of the Cherokee Nation, and considered one of the oldest houses of democratic government in the West. The 1844 George Mural House, built for this merchant who married into the powerful Cherokee Nation Ross family. And evidently this house sort of became a center of society for the Cherokee people. The HABS collection for Oklahoma owes a lot to the efforts of Dr. Charles L. Leiter, professor of landscape architecture at Oklahoma State University. I've already showed you a number of sites, including Peterson Prize entries. Between 1989 and 2007, Professor Leiter led his students to document at least 13 sites, many of which, as I again entered into the prize. Most of them are landscapes, such as the OSU campus, the Villa Philbrook Gardens, and Swan Lake Park, pictured here, but some also included buildings, such as the Overholster and Phillips Estates and the Union Agency building. Leiter also led students to record, using short form reports to record landscapes. And I imagine these were probably done for entry into the House Challenge. So the House program has a thematic challenge every year for the best short form report of a landscape. And this is sort of to create like a larger inventory of landscapes that could hopefully be revisited with more documentation, such as drawings and photographs at a later point. Just to bring things up to more recent, of course, we were very pleased to get Frank Lloyd Wright's Price Tower, a National Historic Landmark, into the HABS collection more recently. While actually, I have to say that Oklahoma is one of the less represented states in the HABS collection. And while Oklahoma had little to offer a HABS program fixated on colonial era architecture in the 1930s, where Oklahoma really shines is its 20th century design. The Art Deco buildings influenced by the oil industry are among the prime examples. But when I entered Art Deco and Oklahoma, all I found at the Library of Congress was these few photographs of the Adair County Courthouse pictured here. So what I would like to see is buildings by the state's own homegrown architects, such as Bruce Goff and his signature organic style, as well as notable Oklahoma modernists as Robert Roloff and Robert Lawson Jones. They would be a welcome addition to the HABS collection, hint, hint. So obviously, even though HABS was fixated on pre-Civil War buildings, that certainly is not true of HABS today, just to reassure everybody. In fact, lately we have focused more on modern architecture to sort of better represent the collection, as well as sites that speak to a more diverse population. So these are some just examples of recent things. On the far right, the prefabricated mid-century modern homes in the Washington, D.C. area, designed by noted architect Charles Goodman. icons of modernism, such as the Hirshhorn Museum in the lower left, and the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts to the center. But we've also been addressing the critical task of recording sites pivotal to such important historical events as American and African American civil rights, Latino heritage, but while also being mindful of the exceptional and the endangered. So very quickly, recent projects include under the rare and endangered, here's a early Dutch H-bent frame house in Frederick, Maryland, which is very rare for Maryland. We documented the Rio Vista Bracero in El Paso, Texas, that operated in the 1950s and 60s to bring much needed temporary farm laborers, or braceros as they were called, from Mexico to work in the agricultural fields of the American South and Southwest. We documented a mid-century modern beach house that was designed by, the prototype was designed by a New York architect and built by a local developer in Delaware. And this model, along with another, won an AIA award for livability in the merchant class in 1963. And this just happened to remain as a pristine example of that earlier prototype. And then finally, we recently added an A-frame structure to the HABS collection. So this is one of the earliest. It's unusual in that its builder and designer, who was just a local landowner, was able to get Douglas fir plywood and other building materials donated in exchange for providing the plans, which they marketed. So these appeared in catalogs all over. So we don't know how many were built, but we're assuming that probably hundreds of these things were built. But we have now an iconic A-frame in the collection. So with that, I'd just like to invite you to explore the HABS collection and see for yourself all the many wonders it has to offer. So I'd be glad to answer any questions.